Now starting, all attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or good morning, whichever is appropriate for your location across the country. Welcome to this fourth in our series of 5 pension webinars for NUPGE components. I'm Elizabeth Ballerman, Secretary-Treasurer of NUPGE and your moderator for the series. I'm going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. We've scheduled an hour for this webinar as opposed to the 45 minutes in previous webinars. We're going to start with a presentation to give us an overview of the practices, principles, and policies that NUPGE components are in with regard to infrastructure investment. Then we're going to turn to a trustee roundtable featuring 3 of our NUPGE pension trustees for about a half an hour. The remaining time we're going to set aside for questions and discussion. So, time permitting, we'll open the floor to questions. You can type your question in the control panel on the right hand of your screen as we go along. So don't wait until we break for questions. We'll have them available at that point in time. And then specify, please, if you want to ask a question to a specific panelist or perhaps offer a comment. At the end of the session, we'll put those questions to the panelists. And if we run out of time, we're going to invite the panelists to provide written responses, which we will then provide to you. Just FYI, we are recording the webinars and we'll have the video available to share with attendees and others afterwards. Now, as you know, our Pension Activist Advisory Committee members, union officers, and trustees within NUPGE play a crucial role in securing and defending our decent pensions for our members, and to help protect good quality pension plans and encourage the investment of our plan assets in the best interest of the plan members, beneficiaries of their communities. We are doing this short format webinar series. We want to thank Shareholder Association for Research and Education in doing the yeoman's work on organizing these sessions for us. We're going to have one remaining webinar scheduled this spring. It's called Investing for Impact, and that'll be held on May 30th. Read more about those on the website in the website invite that you have. So about this webinar, is pension fund investing in public infrastructure a Trojan horse poised to undermine public services and ultimately public sector plans? Or is it the solution to meeting investment targets in a challenging low-return economic environment? Union-appointed trustees face difficult decisions about pension funds investment in infrastructure. This webinar is going to take stock of the current state of infrastructure investment by our public sector pension funds, and we're going to have trustee responses and some new initiatives to guide trustees and discuss new initiatives to guide trustees in infrastructure decision-making. So to start us off, we have Andrew McNeil, who is a national representative here at NUPGE. He has provided us or produced for us a presentation of what's happening with our various plans that NUPGE components are part of across the country with regard to infrastructure investment. So without further ado, Andrew, we turn the floor over to you. Or I am not hearing Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just have to bring the presentation up. Okay, so what I'd just like to do is give an overview of where pension plans that NUPGE members belong to currently have infrastructure investments, and some information about how this takes place and some of the issues we've run across. So what I've got here is a list of pension plans in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And what the table shows you is how much they have in infrastructure, the percent of their investments they have in infrastructure, and the target they have. So this does vary and varies dramatically across the country once you throw in pension plans like HOOP and OMAs. But what you see is that In Western Canada, at least, the percentages are relatively consistent. They're below where the target is. Of course, in some cases, the targets include other asset types. Ontario, you find the outliers. HOOP, that's the hospital employees, don't have a separate category for infrastructure and have relatively little, if any. At the other end of the spectrum is OMAS, which is the Municipal Employees Pension Plan, which has 14.7 billion, or 17% of its investments in infrastructure, and has a target of 21.5%. So some fairly dramatic differences when you're looking at the situation across the country. On the East Coast, again, percentages vary a bit more there. The Nova Scotia Public Service Plan has a target of 25%, so that includes other asset types. But even without that, you have a contrast of a 4% target for the New Brunswick Public Service Plan compared to 11% for the New Brunswick Hospitals Plan. Now, the original way that pension plans invested in infrastructure was in direct investment. Pension plans put their money into investment funds, which in turn put money into specific infrastructure projects. Examples of that would be funds managed by companies like Macquarie or Brookfield. And for smaller pension plans, this is the only way they invest in infrastructure. What has changed, though, is that bigger pension plans are investing directly, or they're investing through provincial pension services corporations like BCIMC in British Columbia or AIMCO in Alberta. The pioneer of this approach was OMAS, the Municipal Pension Plan, which is invested in things like P3 schools in Nova Scotia and the Channel Tunnel rail link in the UK. Not all infrastructure investments are privatization. That is one thing that should be made clear. An example that is not privatization, so I realize is still somewhat controversial, is pipelines. Now, that said, of the types of infrastructure investments that are privatization, the original one was purchasing ownership of the infrastructure. So in other words, in the UK, OMAS own, I believe it's 27% of Thames Water, which provides water and sewer services in London. But there have also been other types of investment in privatized infrastructure, P3s or public-private partnerships, and operating concessions where a company purchases the right to operate the airport, an airport, for instance, and collect the revenues from that airport for a certain period of time. The other distinction is hard versus soft infrastructure, or social infrastructure and hard infrastructure. And that is an issue in a lot of unions around where to invest. There's far less opposition to investing in roads, bridges, transit, and utilities than there is to investing in schools, hospitals, and prisons. Just to go through a couple of examples, and in case anyone feels that I'm pointing fingers, both examples are from a pension fund where I actually have pension credits from past employment. So this is, I've tried to avoid pointing fingers here, but the first example is Thames Water. Canadian pension funds own 36% of it. Now, between 2007 and 2016, Thames Water paid out 2.5 billion in dividends, but at the same time, its debt increased from 3 billion to 10 billion. The unfunded liability in its pension plan increased from 38 million to 249 million. This is all in pounds. Water bills increased by 40% more than inflation across England and Wales. Canadian unions have actually worked to protect the pension plan, and recently the company is trying to repair its image. But there are a number of issues around that. First, that Thames Water has not been regarded as a model provider of public services. In fact, the performance of Thames Water and other water companies have led to calls for renationalisation of water companies in England and Wales. And the other factor is that the role of the unions, that the unions have worked to protect the pension plan for employees at Thames Water, but at the same time, our pension money is invested in a company that is trying to take away pensions from its workers. There's a similar issue with Dynalife DX Labs in Edmonton, in Alberta. The company was created as Dynacare Casper when diagnostic lab services in Edmonton were privatized in the mid-1990s. In 2006, OMAS, that's the Ontario Municipal Pension Plan, through its subsidiary Borealis, acquired a majority stake in Dynacare Casper, which was subsequently renamed Dynalife DX. HSAA, which is an NUPGE component, organized Dynalife DX, and the company refused in negotiations to provide workers with the same pay and benefits as workers in public labs. One of the biggest gaps was the lack of a pension plan. So we have the irony that a company that's owned in part by NUPGE members through their pension plan is increasing its profits by providing lower compensation levels for workers and refusing to provide them with a comparable pension plan. So, you know, our pension plans are making money by refusing to provide some other members of the same union with pensions. So I'll conclude that, and we can get to the panel, which
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So some very interesting thoughts there with regard to what we are doing with our own pension plans. So we're going to move now to the town hall or panel presentation or discussion here with three of our NUPGE pension trustees. And in very neutral alphabetical order, we're going to start with Bert Blunden, or introduce Bert Blunden, who is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Public and Private Employees, otherwise known as NAPE. He is a public service pension plan trustee and previously worked with the Newfoundland and Labrador Department of Work Services and Transportation. Brian Schramm has worked for unions for 35 years. He's currently on staff with BCGEU, the BC Government and General Services Employee Union, and he serves in a variety of capacities on numerous pensions committees, as well as on the boards of the Municipal Pension Plan and Public Service Pension Plans in BC. And then coming back east, Randy Marie Sloat has been named by the Ontario Public Service Employees Union to the Board of Trustee of the OP Trust, which we just heard a little bit about in January of 2012. Randy has years of experience in human resources and labor relations, working with various trade unions and private and public sector employers. As a union activist, she's also president of OPSU Local 201 and serves on numerous local employee relations committees. So welcome panel, thank you for giving us your time. And let's just start with the very general question. What issues do you see arising around infrastructure investment at your pension plans? And I want to be clear here, our panelists are speaking generally. They are going to be very careful not to divulge any confidential information from within their pension board discussions, which of course they are obliged to keep confidential. So starting with Bert.
Yeah, we're probably one of the newer jointly trusted plans in the country, and we had the benefit of learning from other pension plans as we developed our investment policy. And we're relatively young in the infrastructure space, as you've seen on the slide earlier. We only have about 75 million invested. But we have, with the assistance of some trustees, particularly on the union side, convincing trustees on the employer side, the merit of being very careful what investments in infrastructure we can do, because you know, we convince trustees that this debate is more than about a fiduciary responsibility of delivering returns. There's also different types of risk. There's political risk, there's reputational risk. That I think trustees today have to be more concerned about than just whether you're going to get a 5% return or a 5.5% return. So I think we've been fortunate in our pension plan to be able to consider some of those issues that maybe decisions were made in the past by other similar types of plans that didn't have the benefit of that experience. So we're relatively new, relatively young. And just trying to get our feet wet, but we do have some at least policies around infrastructure that other plans may not have.
Thanks, Bert. Brian, what can you tell us about your pension plans?
I can echo a lot of what Bert has just said. I think that in terms of the boards itself, they take a strategic approach. So we're looking at a relatively high level, but more and more, we've tended to focus on environmental, social, governance issues. Our boards have been joint trustee for years, so we've pretty much handled the governance aspect of these issues. But we're drilling down now in terms of the governance with the infrastructure investments itself. Things like whether or not when we take on an infrastructure investment, we end up with a board seat, that type of stuff. We're also looking at a lot more and questioning a lot more around the environmental actions of some of these companies, the social responsibilities. Like you can, I've noticed a shift in the last few years around worker issues, gender representation, executive compensation, climate change for the infrastructure investments within the plans is becoming more and more. And the other piece that comes into it that seems to be creeping into the conversation as well is who we partner with. Who are our partners? And touching on the reputational risk, I think communication to the boards and what the investment firms are doing relative to communication with our investment structures is coming to the forefront as well. Is that we want to know how our investment managers are communicating about these investments when there are issues such as TEMS that we have a piece of as well. It's becoming a more pressing issue that communication is handled responsibly rather than the past. They took a very low profile and basically the comment was no comment.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And we're going to have some more opportunity to broaden this discussion. Randy, what about you as far as issues in your plans?
Well, our overall goal is to pay pensions today and protect pensions for tomorrow. So our infrastructure investment is looked at the same as any other investment, and we have a statement of responsible investing principles. So we look at all of the risks, as the other gentlemen have talked about, political, regulatory, climate-related, labor-related, international labor rights, commitment to workers that are employed by the company or the assets that we earn. We look at reputational, environment, social, governance risks, and anything that we're going to invest in is looked at by the risk committee, the same as if we were investing in real estate or other funds. Generally, we do not invest in P3s. We have concerns about a waste of taxpayers' money, and that many of them are not ending up with a unionized labor force. Generally, we work with a strategic partner, and we look at working with that partner and specialize in building, managing, and in particular road and rail. Our chief investment officer also looks at every potential investment to see if it is a good investment for us and presents it to the CEO. It is very rare that the actual details of a deal come to the board. As Brian said, we're more strategic.
Okay, thanks, Randy. So number of things. So let's get a little bit more into the policies. All of you alluded to policies that you have in place with regard to infrastructure investment. What can you expand a little bit more on what kind of policies and practices guide the decision making when you are looking at an infrastructure investment? And usually, for the most part, we are talking here about public infrastructure. Although I will confirm for Andrew that he had that pipeline clip in his session before Rachel Notley indicated yesterday they might buy an equity share in the pipeline. That's my editorial comment, and I'll turn it over to you. So again, the policies and practices, Brian.
Okay. I think, like all plans, most plans have a statement of what's called a SIP, Statement of Investment Principles, basically. And within our SIP, we have various sections. We have a section covering infrastructure with some fundamental principles that would guide the investment manager. That the investments will consist of tangible long life assets that have a potential for strong cash flows and favorable risk return characteristics. So they're looking to match with pension liabilities. So they would, that would be sort of a guiding principle that would guide them. There's other, they're typically physical assets and provide essentially services such as utilities and transportation systems. So, and sometimes they can actually get into renewables as well in terms of timberland and farmland. But they have, they look within the SIP, and there's also provisions around the code of conduct. We look at things like partners are rated on merit. We have a RI policy as well, that they're committed to responsible investing and following that. They also, other policies that come into play are like the asset liability mix. We have a risk model that they're required to follow. Again, ESG, code of ethics, belief statements as well. All of those are kind of formed by the board and guide the investment managers. And they also cover things like voting rights as well in the responsible investment policy. I won't go into detail on that. I'll leave that maybe if others want to do that. The other thing is we subscribe to the PRI responsible Principles for Responsible Investing and the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance. So that guides our investment managers as well.
Okay, thanks. Randy, have you got anything that is different within your plans?
Well, we do have an internal management investment policy and a company-wide risk committee that look at all of the potential investments prior to recommendation. We also look at the International Labour Organization principles of any of the companies that we're investing in.
Mm-hmm. So making sure that they are complying with the ILO fundamental freedoms and the various conventions there. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, the right to form and join trade unions and bargain collectively.
Right, which, gee, is kind of important to us. Bert, what about in Newfoundland?
Yeah, we're a little bit different in some jurisdictions, I would suggest. We've actually wrote in our manager's contract the degree of latitude as far as private infrastructure is concerned. And within that contract, the manager can't invest in a P3 model, for example, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, without the consent of our board of directors. And they can't invest in any infrastructure in Canada where it would result in layoffs of current employees who are employed in that sector. Unfortunately, it didn't go outside our borders, and I think that was an error on our part when we first organized this. But some people question, well, why would you want it to come back to your board? Well, I think if you've read the background information here, really is a difficult process to stop investments in P3s and those types of undertakings. So we wanted, the union people on the board wanted a way to at least have some say. And we felt the best way to do that was force whoever the proponent was of the project to come talk to the board, make its case, and of course, then we could have discussions with unions who were involved and kind of force them to go away and make their own deal that the unions were comfortable with before we would sanction any deal, instead of saying, yeah, we won't do it, but somebody else will. So it was about trying to control the project with a view that you may not be able to stop it. And of course, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've just had 3 hospitals announced in under that system, but up to now, nobody has come to our board asking for permission to invest in those models. So it is a little bit different. I will tell you, when we had those discussions, of course, the employer side was trying to browbeat you into submission about fiduciary responsibility, and it's only about returns, and the list goes on. And of course, we successfully argued that, you know, the impact upon a worker who's in this same pension plan losing their job, we believe we have a fiduciary responsibility to that individual too, and convinced some of our colleagues on the what normally would be the other side of the table, or come from a different background, and merit of that argument too. And I think in an earlier comment, people talked about political risk and reputational risk, even though it's not directly related to infrastructure. But you know, everybody unfortunately remembers the shootings in the U.S. only to find out, you know, that we had shootings in schools, and the teachers' pension plan down there was invested in gun manufacturers. Well, to me, that's a huge reputational risk and political risk, and part of what we were trying to do is control not only the investment risk, but the political risk and the reputational risk too. The other thing that's different with us is that our sponsor board controls the asset mix and not the board of trustees, which is kind of a different model too. One could argue that at any given time, if they didn't like the avenue that this was taken, the sponsors themselves could take away the latitude of the trustee board to invest in such undertaking. So I would argue that we've structured it in such a way to at least lend some voice to what's happening out there in the community or the broader community. It's not perfect, but we may have opportunities that some other pension plans may not enjoy in that respect.
Okay, thanks very much. So pretty expansive responses here, and starting to address some of the questions we're going to have coming up. So hopefully we will have plenty of time for discussions. So it leads us to, we've been dancing around this, what are you able to consider with regard to the union priorities and policies with regard to privatization? And all of you have touched on it a little bit already, but perhaps we can just go on that a little bit more fully. Randy, how about we start with you on this one?
Well, for the union priorities and policies, if it's a traditional P3 model, we do not invest in them. The union policy has been not to support them, and our board upholds that. There's a higher cost to fund. The private companies want to make profits. The union is not generally involved in organizing the workers. So we have traditionally stayed away from them. Now, recently we heard about an initiative in Quebec that is quite interesting, that it's a 2-3, if you want to put it that way, 2P, where the union's funds are actually investing in infrastructure. And to me, I want to follow that closely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, the interest that we have, of course, is as public sector unions, is not using our own pension plans to privatize our own members' work, right? Bert.
Yeah, I guess it's really partly answered in my last response, that our sponsorship board, who's not constrained with fiduciary responsibility, controls our asset mix, which may influence the power of the board of trustees if the unions at the sponsorship board are so inclined to try to use that power that they have elsewhere. But we've also, and I'll just speak from my own union's perspective here, NAPE just came out of a round of collective bargaining where we tried to address the whole question of what happens if we have P3s in the public sector, and got some relatively strong language in our collective agreement now to guard against that. But generally, obviously, we're against privatization. We're against P3s for all the reasons that people have outlined before. We don't think it's good value for money. In many cases, I think we've seen reports across the country and experience from other jurisdictions that it's not the panacea that the private sector would have us to believe. So I think there's a blurring of lines sometimes about my role as a trustee and my role as a representative of our union, but sometimes they can go hand in hand, and you can try to protect members' interests and the public's interests in two different forms. In one place, you may not be successful, but you may be successful in the other. But it's important, I believe, for our unions to work closely with our trustees to make sure that we're at least with our thinking, we're both on side and that we're not at cross purposes with each other.
Great, thank you. And Brian.
Okay, like I said earlier, that basically the boards themselves are not directly involved in vetting and selecting and approving investments, but at the same time, as a trustee, it's interesting because they have 35-year history with labor movement, but also my views when I get to the board become very influenced by what I perceive as my fiduciary responsibilities. And so ultimately it becomes the board's priorities and decisions that will influence the investment manager in making their selection in terms of infrastructure. But it gets very interesting because what I find is that if we utilize the SIP and our beliefs and our policies, we can layer in that labor perspective into our beliefs and those policies, in particular around the area of responsible investing and ESG. So that's where I tend to hear the dialogue in terms of, if we want to call them workers' rights, or the impact on workers or impact on community or the social fabric that we as trade unionists so strongly identify. One of the things about that I get apprehensive about in bringing a head-on union priority or policy to the board is that we have to consider we have other partners there. And if we're going to consider something that we're extremely passionate about, then we can get tangled in with the employer government partners in terms of what their policies or priorities are, which quite honestly don't necessarily align with ours, and we could get into an ideological discussion rather about ultimately what the purpose of the pension boards and those investment is, and could distract us from actually our primary purpose, which is the pensions. So it's a fine line how we bring in our union ideology and our beliefs in terms of our investments and the infrastructure. It's a challenge.
So what I'm hearing then is that in dealing with these, whichever hat you're wearing, but that in order to actually bring those union principles into play, that you're actually making the argument that it is within the fiduciary responsibility. In fact, by considering these things as part of your ESG screen, it's within that fiduciary responsibility to be able to work on your investment policies. So
yeah, by way of example, I'd say executive compensation. If executives are excessively compensated, it's not returning to shareholders. Or if there's not gender representation on their boards, it's influencing the decisions of those companies. That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question we've also touched on, as particularly Bert has touched on, saying, we have a policy of not investing in privatized infrastructure, and remember, we're talking here about public infrastructure in your own provinces, but maybe you can make those in other jurisdictions. So what what do we see as the consequences of those? And Bert, you've kind of touched on that and said that, you know, you might look differently at your manager's contract. Maybe very briefly, if you've got anything to add to what you've already provided us.
Yeah, and I think I commented too that even within Canada, we have certain rules about not investing in private infrastructure. But I think that's problematic in the sense that we go to another country and invest, and we really have no controls over what the manager is doing if it fits into all the guidelines, obviously. So, you know, one jurisdiction comes here and invests, and we go in their jurisdiction to invest, and we've really solved nothing. All we've done is taken $1 from here, and somebody else puts $1 in where we're investing to. So I think in the long run, it's a neutral game, and we see that by some of the examples that Andrew had presented earlier, and how we influence those decisions, whether it's as shareholders, if we're inadvertently or forced to invest in certain projects, I think. May be our second line of defense to try to help out in jurisdiction where our money has been used. But it becomes much more complex and much more difficult. But within our own jurisdiction, what we attempted to do is at least be able to intervene with our own debate. And a tie vote is a last vote. If you can't convince us that it's a worthwhile project, you're not going to have none of our money. So. You know, and I think other speakers have talked about it's more than investment returns. Because quite frankly, you can probably get investment returns in other areas that can mirror with less risk. You know, because if you're investing in other countries, there's currency risk. There's all kinds of investment risk. You know, so I think we need to be careful too and keep lobbying and make sure our money is being invested and in places and jurisdictions that part of our concern has to be how workers are being treated, how it affects the community, and where, you know, we should kind of reject where our money is being used to hollow out public infrastructure and control in other countries. It's not good enough to say, well, it's on the other side of the ocean, so it should be of no concern to us.
All right, thanks. Brian.
Yeah, BC has taken a little bit of a different approach. They're basically, especially with the BCGU, if we didn't get involved in the privatization, we probably would be half the size we are now. So we basically followed our members wherever we could and tried to protect the pension plan that they were covered by in those situations. So in terms of that, like we look at it like, you know, we may have, if we limit it to outside our province, we may miss opportunities. I'll give you an example. Canada Line was built, and one union had a policy of not organizing or getting involved with P3s because it was a P3, and the pension plan was a 1/3 partner with government, and because it's a concession, and SNC Lavalin, which is somewhat of an unsavory partner, but that's another conversation. But we were able to unionize it, and this year we actually brought them into the PSPP. So we've leveraged our partnership to influence some of the things that are going on, and I'm sure many of you know that SNC Lavalin partook in there was a lengthy labor dispute because they wanted to get rid of the I think it was the power plants back east that they wanted to get rid of the pension plan in that. So it was very unique for us to get that in place here. I think it gives us input and influence in locally operated companies through company boards. And I would say that if we're considering, unions are considering infrastructure, I think one of the things we've sort of approach we've taken is that our infrastructure deals are now tied to board seats. We want board seats because that's the only way we're going to have direct input. And we don't want to give way to anti-union ownership and see profits go offshore. So that's sort of our approach on it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And Randy.
Well, you've heard me say that generally we do not support P3s, and the reasons why. We prefer to go into any private infrastructure with a valuable partner. One of them that we use is Global Via. And in that way, we are protecting our ownership as well as the rights of the workers that are involved in the companies.
Okay. Thanks. So we've been discussing infrastructure investment off and on in the union movement, in the pension community for literally 2 decades. And as we're discussing, you'll see there's a couple of handouts up on the site that are available to you. One of them is from the Committee on Workers' Capital, which is an international group that has published a set of guidelines with regard to investment in infrastructure, and the other is a recent one that came to the NUPGE National Executive Board at its recent meeting, and was basically approved by the Board of Directors of, or the National Executive Board of NUPGE, and where we're looking at a number of principles that we hope will provide some guidance as to if we're going to use this vast pool of capital that governments and others want us to use to invest in their projects. Can we figure out a way of doing that and basically having our cake and eat it too? Will these help us invest in something that helps our pension plans but does not lead to privatization? So those are available for you there, and we wonder, for the panelists, do you find these guidelines that are articulated, are they helpful to you? Do you have concerns with any of them? Understanding that in your role as pension trustees, you cannot be completely restricted by these. So where shall we go first? Let's start with Brian on this one.
Yeah, I think ultimately we've got to remember that fiduciaries have an independent responsibility to the plan, and that's one. And unions understand that when they appoint their trustees, employers understand that, government understands that. So to have things that are mandated are difficult, but it definitely should form a part of. It's informative to for union trustees, for NUPGE representatives, to have that kind of thought process going in, understanding it's a joint process. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. Randy, what about at OP Trust?
Well, we basically have our guidelines and policies and procedures. The board sets the strategic direction, and then we have our paid professionals that execute it for us. I referred briefly to a new model that I just heard about when I was at the BC Pension Forum. It was called Innovative Infrastructure. In Canada needs money for infrastructure, but the pension plans that have union representatives were at an impasse. This is a small infrastructure projects. They have about 400 million invested, and it's a model where the union is putting up the money through a social economy. Their goal is to provide, create, maintain, and protect jobs in Quebec, and they're funding student housing, public schools, libraries, arenas, cultural centers, and land acquisition. So I'm very interested in that model. The rate of return is better than what the fund would have got in a traditional bond, but less than the private companies that are traditionally involved. And I think that could be a good model that we may be able to look for in the future.
Something that potentially add into that asset mix, maybe a whole other class, right? There we go.
Well, the interesting thing with that is that the tenant can actually buy out the property in later years at a preset time at a fair market value. So, you know, if I'm building a school, then that school will revert and not be owned by an independent.
All right. Yeah, so some interesting stuff happening up if you read some of the background and various books and things, including I've got one on my desk from the CCPA, Money on the Line, that talks about a whole lot of that stuff. So Bert, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's important for those involved in this webinar to realize too that this is just not a one-sided debate, that unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, Board of Trustees are made up of equal representation from employers and unions who appoint their half. And it's not as simple as saying that we control our own money and our own destiny, because we don't. We have to come up with policies, well thought out, well researched, that we can use to convince our colleagues on those boards of the merits of what we're trying to do too. If not, we kind of have status quo going forward, and very little changes, and in many cases our own money can be used against us. So I think it's important to remember that unions don't have, or trustees or sponsors don't have, from our perspective, don't have absolute control over our members' money. I think it's important. It's important too that we provide, you know, education to our own trustees and our own members, so we can engage in that debate when we need to make our own points, and hopefully move people towards our thinking. And I think the third component in that is we can never forget that our greatest strength is in our collective agreements. And if we're talking about public infrastructure, particularly where our own members work, that we shouldn't be afraid to use the collective agreements to try to protect or guard against investments in public infrastructure that privatizes our own members' jobs who are paying into the pension plans. Of course, they lose their jobs and lose their pensions too. So I think there's more than one way to go at this issue. But I think that that collectively we have to have a lot of debate against our labor relations practitioners versus our trustee practitioners versus our leaders. So I think it's a more holistic approach that we need to use to this infrastructure debate.
Okay, thanks very much. So we're doing quite well here. I want to congratulate everybody. We're almost exactly where we wanted to be as we head towards questions. But Brian is indicating he'd like to add one more policy item, and if you want to do that briefly, Brian, go right ahead, and then we will go to the questions. And again, invite our participants to type those into your chat function. Brian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, this just comes under the context of what kind of policies would help guide our decision making. I think one of the things Bert touched on, working collectively, but I think we need to work, large capital needs to work together collectively more. There was an interesting paper in 2014, Harvard Business Review by a couple guys, one of them former CPP investment board, about taking a long-term view. There's pressure from financial markets on short-term results. And if the major players, including pension funds, could act together in the best interest of clients and the members, by failing to engage corporate leaders to shape the company's long-range course, we're missing an opportunity. The short-termism is what does damage to our workers in many, many cases, or to the environment. And we let investment consultants pick external managers who focus on these short-term results. So I think the focus on short-term by companies influencing and it influences prices make suboptimal decisions for creating long-term value, which is what we're about. We need to be looking at long-term, and the more we can influence companies to think long-term rather than short-term, the better it will be for our infrastructure investments and others.
Okay, thanks. All right, going to questions now. And the first question is for Randy. Okay, Randy, you mentioned that the fund has a policy to look at the ILO fundamental rights and principles at work. Is this done at the outset or once the investment is made? How is that analysis delivered to the board to inform the decision-making by trustees? So the ILO screen.
Well, we have a responsible investing team at OP Trust. So all of that is done prior to any recommendation of investment to the Chief Investment Officer. So, you know, the people that are out in the field would look at it. They will then, it'll be vetted through the Responsible Investment Group. It'll be vetted through the Risk Committee. And very seldom does anything come to the board. We set the policies and procedures. But all of those things, the UN principles, the international labor principles, are all looked at with every investment.
And that would be before the investment is actually made, so that you don't find yourself having to now divest yourself of some great big asset.
Exactly. We don't want to do that, and we don't want to lose money. So all of that is screened prior to recommendation of the asset.
Right. And that, of course, is particularly important with regard to infrastructure, which tends by its nature to be fairly illiquid. You can't just turn that around like a cash kind of an asset. And so, you know, that seems to be a reasonable way of operating there. So, okay. Do we have any other questions? I do not see any other questions coming up. We know that we can talk about this as we have.
Elizabeth, sorry, this is Tamara. I can't actually access my email. Hello, hi everyone. But Ian Johnson, who is on the call, sent me a question over email, so I'll just read it out for you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so Ian is wondering how plans go about selecting strategic partners to help advise on infrastructure investments. How much control do you have? Also, how do you deal with possible P3 investments at the international level in other countries? And I'll type that out for our panelists as well.
Okay, that's quite broad. And strategic partners, I'm not sure exactly what Ian means by that, whether he means the other investment partners or whether he means people like investment managers. So we'll leave that pretty much wide open for the interpretation of our panelists. Who would like to start with that? We just finished with Randy. Let's go to Brian.
Okay.
Sorry, Elizabeth.
I'm still done.
Oh, we've got Brian.
Yeah, okay, I'm just digesting the question. But basically, again, it's done by BCIMC. It's now BCI, actually. They've rebranded themselves. But they choose their partners that they're going to partner with in terms of infrastructure investment. And this is where it creeps in for the board in the area of reputational risk, because sometimes we find ourselves in partnership with people that, as a unionist, we wouldn't want to be caught in the same building as, let alone the same bed. And so I think that in terms of policies, I think that it comes back to, I talked about code of conduct. The code of conduct requires that the BCI chooses partners based on merit. I don't know that their screening on merit would be as diligent as perhaps my screening on merit. And that's where sometimes we turn over control, and that's when it, I sort of like Randy's model where they get to see things and maybe provide some input to the investment manager in some of these things.
Okay, thanks. Bert, what about at your end?
Yeah, when it gets to the manager or investment level, obviously there's a process that we go through first, and I think most plans would be like this, to screen managers for that area of expertise. That's usually done by our investment committee, who then makes a recommendation to the board of directors what manager we should hire. And then, of course, within the manager's mandate is the screens that those managers have to use when they're investing. That's then overseen by our investment committee, whose responsibility is to make sure that our investment manager is adhering to the principles that were enshrined in his contract. So I wouldn't, as a trustee, I wouldn't necessarily see that work unless I specifically asked for it, other than routine updates from our investment committee, which obviously there'd be a lot of work between the managers and employees of our pension investment corporation. So yeah, that's the type of oversight that we would have. But as long as it wasn't offside with their mandate as a board of trustees, I'd rarely see what they were investing in, unless I took the time, and which I do obviously, to see what they're investing in. But we wouldn't have a decision-making role in what those investments would be at that point in time, unless it was offside with their mandate.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Thank you. And Randy?
Well, generally, the companies that we use, we've used for quite a while, and many of the tips on what are potential investments coming up come through companies such as Macquarie or Global Via, or our real estate team, who is perhaps looking at a hotel or a mall or a property, and then finds out that there's infrastructure next door to it being built. So the teams, although they all have their own mandates and their own achievement as part of our asset mix, they work together and pass off tips.
Okay, thanks. And presumably, as Bert said, if you find something that is completely offensive in the asset mix when you do become aware of it, that would be subject to questions, and it might or might not be subject to actually making a change in that investment. So I don't see any more questions coming at. Either we've done a brilliant job in answering everybody's questions, or the people are puzzled. I'm preferring to think the former. I'm hoping that our members have found this to be useful for them. This question of infrastructure investment is probably not going to go away. It hasn't gone away for 2 decades. But as we have our trustees on various boards of trustees dealing with our pension funds, it's, I would hope, helpful to have a discussion and a conversation about how we manage these things. So with that, we have no further, our next pension webinar is on May 30th. It is called Investing for Impact. So we're going to talk a little bit more about investment and investment practices, but more broadly than just infrastructure at that point in time. And with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists: Bert Blunden in Newfoundland, Labrador, Randy Murray Sloat in Ontario, and Brian Schramm in BC. And also, of course, Andrew McNeil at our office, who prepared the background information at the beginning. And finally, and certainly not least, Tamara Herman and the folks at Share, who really have done a great job in running these webinars for us and helping us with technical bits and pieces, with bringing people together, herding the cats, as it were. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody and sign off in Ottawa. Best to all.